Okay. Janine? Let's turn it off. Yeah. Okay, we're getting started. And for those who are anxiously anticipating the afternoon, I will mention that we have one item. Where is it? We have one item in the afternoon that says it will not be heard before 1 o'clock. Actually, it will be heard at 1:15. So that gives you a little extra time for lunch. And so this is our last item for this morning. And we're very pleased to see all of you. Do you want to introduce your panel?
Yes. So good morning, Vice Chair Spivey Weber and board members. My name is John Borkovich. I'm the program manager with the Gamma unit, and I'm joined today up here at the dais by Dory Bellin, our geologist with the Gamma program, and by Joe Karkowski and Clay Rogers. There's two layers of presenters today on our panel. They also include our coalition groups from Region 5. The Rice Commission will be making a presentation. Tim Johnson is here today. And the East San Joaquin Valley Coalition, Perry Clausen will be here. Then we'll transition to the Central Coast Regional Board, where Darren Polhemus will make a summary of where Region 3 is right now with their process, and then Perry will rejoin us for the Salinas Valley presentation.
And I apologize, Jonathan, I didn't give you a chance to say what this panel will be doing. We now know who will be doing it, but what will they be doing?
So this panel is prepared to respond to the recommendations in the nitrate report to the legislature on doing areas of concern for nitrate contamination in groundwater. They're giving you a series of options to think about. And so what we'll be looking for is discussion and direction from the board on which sets of maps we should put up on the website.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as John just said, provide information on the draft nitrate maps that were created. We'll also discuss regional local efforts as I identified by our other panel members today. I'm clicking. Oh. Oops, okay, so there's three basic approaches that have been used to define these draft map areas. We used, it's a vast oversimplification of what's gone on, but essentially what's been done is there have been usage of vulnerable areas, we'll call them, groundwater basin maps, as well as well water quality. We'll also be discussing the advantages and challenges within each of the draft maps. We'll also be talking about staff's preferred draft map approach, but we're looking for your input on these maps, so it'll be good to hear your, solicit your input from on the maps. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dory Bellin, who will go through the details of the maps that were created.
Good morning. Early last fall of last year, we went ahead and convened a work group with Region 5, 3, and 6 and staff here at the Water Board, and we created an initial draft map. We then did create here at the State Water Board some additional draft maps with some alternate approaches. We did share all of these draft maps with DFA, Department of Food and Ag, as was required with our new Memorandum of Understanding. And we do update and reevaluate these areas as we get new information, new data comes along. So we're going to start by looking at framing the issue. We wanted to look at how many wells have actually been sampled for nitrate in the state since 2000. This map shows 42,838 wells in the blue. In the green, we see a little over 11,000 wells that were above 1/2 the MCL for nitrate, which is 45 milligrams per liter. This shows the distribution of wells that were determined to be above the MCL, about 5,800.
So real quickly to clarify, though, we use all the available data for groundwater wells that are in GeoTracker Gamma. So it's not only public supply wells, but also environmental monitoring wells and other wells that have been sampled.
I mentioned convening that work group. This is the initial map that was created within that work group. The State Water Board did publish hydrogeologically vulnerable areas. This is one GIS layer that we did start with. We then used the Department of Pesticide Regulation leaching groundwater protection areas, which are seen here. We put those together, and then we wanted to find what was in common or intersect this information with its susceptibility. So we have the irrigated agricultural lands from the Farmland Mapping and Monitoring Program, and the location of dairy lands throughout the state. This was then intersected with that first information that I showed you, and we get this area in common. We then wanted to add those sections from the public land survey system where we had a well that had a detection, at least one of them above 1/2 the MCL, adding that to the map, and its adjoining sections around that section. So the 8 sections that are around that 1 mile square then changes the map to look like this. So this is our initial map. We do have some advantages and challenges with this map. An advantage is that it does cover the areas outside of our defined groundwater basins as defined by the Department of Water Resources. One of the challenges is, though, that it assumes that there's a high nitrate level based on its land activity. Remember, I did mention we use those GIS layers like irrigated lands and dairy lands. So that assumes that we have nitrate levels that are either above 1/2 the MCL or already impairment in those areas. Another challenge would be that it does, like we see in this inset, it does produce some inconsistent and irregular polygons where it would be hard to define those areas. And it does beg the question, why this section and not the neighboring section? We then moved into those alternate approaches. One of them is the Basin Approach. And what we did with here is we looked at that those blue dots that I showed you, the total number of wells that have been sampled for nitrate in the state since 2000. And we wanted to look at an individual groundwater basin to see, to define areas based on those basins where 25% of the wells in that basin have at least either one detection above 1/2 the MCL, one detection above the MCL, or 3 detections above 1/2 the MCL. And this just shows you an example. On the right, statewide, we see all the groundwater basins as defined by DWR. And on the left in the inset, you see one basin, it's a sub-basin actually, the West Coast sub-basin of the coastal plain of LA, showing you with those gray dots are the total number of wells that have been sampled for nitrate, red being those that have been at least one detection above 1/2 the MCL. And in this basin, it does qualify under one of the maps because we have 26% of those wells were above 1/2 the detection of the MCL. So here's our second map. This is based on one detection above 1/2 the MCL. This third map shows you where we've had at least one detection above the MCL. And our fourth map shows you where we've had at least 3 detections above 1/2 the MCL. Our advantages and challenges with the Basin Approach maps. An advantage would be that that area has a definitive boundary. We already know what those groundwater basins are, where they stop and where they start. Another advantage would be Idaho actually uses the same criteria for their areas of concern for nitrate. A challenge would be that it does not include those areas outside of basins, obviously. I mean, you can see that inset, it shows you the blue dots would be wells that have had one detection above 1/2 the MCL, and the purple area is a basin. And you can see that there are some dots there in the upper left-hand corner outside that basin. And it does include those basins that have a small number of wells. So if we only have 4 wells in a basin, maybe it's a very small sub-basin, and we have 2 of those wells above 1/2 the detection, or 1/2 the MCL, then we would have 50% of those wells. And, you know, do we want to label a basin as is impaired based on that few number of wells? This displays with our first map with in the Basin Approach on the left are 1/2 the MCL at one detection, and it shows you where those wells are located. And it does show you that those well locations do tend to fall within those basin boundaries. On the right shows that third Basin Approach map that I showed you, and those well locations that have had at least 3 detections above 1/2 the MCL.
But some wells are obviously outside of the basin boundaries.
Our third approach was to find those areas based on one's proximity to the wells indicated on the map. This is a map that shows where we've had the number of detections per well. And the blue shows that we've had 1 detection at 1/2 the MCL. This would be 2 detections in that same well, 3 to 5 detections in the orange above 1/2 the MCL, and this is greater than 5 detections. So one would look at this and say, if I live near these wells, I should probably consider having my well water tested. So this is a proximity approach that we use. It doesn't define an area, but it tells all the information that we do have. If you are located near these red wells, then you should probably have your well water tested.
Do you have the pros and cons of that particular approach?
The pro would be that it does display just the information that we have, the water quality information. It doesn't go into any kind of discussion, any assumptions after that point. One of the challenges would be that it doesn't actually define a definitive area. So one could digest that information in their own way.
So another way to say it is that an advantage of that map is that it's looking at just pure data. So the data have been put up against different thresholds to populate the map. So if you're in an area where the dot is red, it's very likely you're in an area where you would want to have your water sampled, as opposed to looking at alternative approaches where we're looking at also land use, or if you're in a basin, so it's just straight up if you're a well. So the disadvantage of that is where there are no wells that we have in our system, there may be instances where there are people that are consuming water or using water in areas where we don't have data.
I have a question about the what you have there result. If you live near these wells, you should consider having your well water tested. Why not say that on the other maps?
Well, we could have. The idea here is that these wells, as staff suggested, are really pure data. They tell us where we have confirmed information about nitrate contamination above a certain threshold. The other maps are interpretations of the information, making assumptions about using the basin approach as one example. Is the assumption is that if you have a certain number of wells above, then the whole basin is at risk or could be at risk. And what we would be looking for, I think, before we jump into the regional board's discussion, is thinking about what is the best way for us to describe to the public where there might be an instance where there is nitrate contamination that they might be drinking and that they might want to have their well tested. From my opinion, what we're looking at from the state board is a area of concern for nitrate. And what we'll be talking about in a minute with the, from the regional board's point of view is how you would look at the same kinds of mapping situations for looking at regulatory concerns, which are a little different, and that makes it hard for these maps to do one purpose if you're using, use one map to do multiple purposes, because they have different approaches. So I think you're right that if we decided on one set of maps, we would use that same sort of information about these are the areas where you should be concerned about getting your well tested if you are in the proximity. We happen to use it on this one and the last one, but that's, if we ended up choosing one set of maps to use, we would be using it for that purpose and describing it that way.
Have you looked at, I'm sure you have, but the shallow versus confined aquifer data, and have you sorted it that way at all, or is that beyond the scope of what you were going to look at?
We haven't discriminated any wells based on its well depth. So this information, as John said, includes all the data sets we have available, whether those shallow or deep aquifers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in terms of communicating, that's something we need to reckon with, you know, in terms of risk, because a lot of shallow nitrate data may not pose, you know, immediate risk anyway with deeper aquifers. Would you not agree?
It goes both ways. We have a lot of data from drinking water wells that are not in the shallow zone, and many small or private domestic wells tend to be shallower, and so we might not actually have information from the zone that is of the biggest concern to folks that are not getting their wells tested today.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I hear you. Oh, and then for the, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add that the data from GeoTracker for underground storage tank cleanups and site cleanups are typically shallower wells.
Yeah.
And for years, they've also tested for nitrate, so that's populated that shallower zone. So, I mean, it's a matter of scale, but there is some overlap.
Yeah, good. And then finally, for the listeners at home or the lay folks, could you briefly describe when you talk about hydrologically vulnerable areas, what are criteria used to determine that?
So, in a nutshell, that effort was created back in 2000. DWQ staff looked at, basically it was a library information search. So they looked at DWR and USGS reports and identified areas that have water table conditions. So there's no aquitard or clay layer between the surface and where they first encountered groundwater. So they mapped those areas out. So there's not a correlation with the subbasin basin map. It's a unique set of circumstances that were looked at. By default, though, the map does not show fractured bedrock, which is, by definition, would be vulnerable, but it would depend upon where you are.
So, should we, you wanted us to opine on our favorite map, but should we wait and hear from the regional boards first before we
Yeah,
have that
that would
discussion?
be,
Okay, that would be my preference.
And with that, here's Joe Karkowski from the Central Valley Regional Water Board.
Good morning, Madam Vice Chair, members of the board. My name's Joe Karkowski. I'm the program manager for our Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. And what I'm going to do is provide a little context for the discussions you'll hear from our two coalitions that will come up next. So they didn't just do these groundwater quality assessments out of the goodness of their heart. We actually have some orders that we've adopted that have regulatory requirements. I'm going to go briefly over the relevant portions of that. So one, and you saw this map from Dory for the whole state. This map shows the irrigated cropland within the Central Valley. And there are about 7.5 million acres of irrigated land, so that's roughly about 3/4 or so of the irrigated cropland in the state. About 500,000 acres is actually regulated through our dairy program, and the rest will eventually be regulated in total through our Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. So our new orders have a number of key concepts concepts relative to this discussion. One is we identify high and low vulnerability areas, so similar to what we're talking about with high risk. However, one thing to point out is we're not just focused on nitrate. It's high or low vulnerability with respect to any constituent that could be discharged to groundwater. We're also doing a similar effort with respect to surface water. So we're doing that to focus the requirements and plans on high vulnerability areas. So rather than having uniform requirements throughout a given watershed area, we're trying to focus everybody's collective energy on those areas that either where we know there's a water quality impact or there's a threat to water quality. So the high vulnerability areas, and you'll hear from the Rice Commission, the East San Joaquin Coalition, will be initially identified by the third-party group or the coalition. However, the executive officer will approve or maybe modify those vulnerability areas based on the information that is submitted. So one of the differences between this order and our approach in our irrigated lands program and maybe other orders, say, that you have for NPDES or underground storage tanks, is we have relatively limited monitoring, but there's a big focus on management practice implementation and reporting. So that's where we're getting a lot of our information on whether water quality is being protected. So the objectives of these groundwater quality assessment reports are four main objectives. One is to provide an assessment of available data and information to be able to determine those high and low vulnerability areas. And then even within those, we may have some relatively large high vulnerability areas, so we need to establish priorities for both monitoring and conducting studies. The report will provide a basis for establishing our monitoring, trend monitoring, and management practices evaluation. So rather than having every single grower evaluate on their farm how effective their practices are through monitoring, we allow for studies to be conducted under representative conditions to evaluate the effectiveness of practices for a given crop, given soil conditions, et cetera. And then finally, this will provide a basis for establishing groundwater quality management plans in high vulnerability areas and priorities for implementation. So I'll show this graphically. So really, when you think about it, the way to improve water quality in a non-point source setting is not generally through treatment, it's through implementation of management practices. So I'm going to try to show the connection between this assessment report and that management practice implementation. So as I indicated, the assessment report will provide the information needed to make these vulnerability designations. Based on that, the assessment report will also help us decide where to conduct the groundwater monitoring, and we'll have some background information, so we'll know where there might be data gaps. Based on both the assessment report, the monitoring that's conducted in these vulnerability designations, will identify where to develop the groundwater quality management plans. So these plans will be developed for high vulnerability areas. And the plans will be developed by the coalition, and they'll identify some of the practices that a grower could implement to attain water quality objectives or protect groundwater quality. Now the grower will be expected to implement, to the extent they haven't already, implement practices consistent with that groundwater quality management plan, and thereby hopefully we'll see the water quality improvements. Now of course there are feedback loops. So the coalition provides us with annual reports which may result in changes to the vulnerability designations. If we're improving water quality, it might go from high to low vulnerability. We might identify some additional data needs, so we may change the amount of groundwater quality monitoring that's being done. And it'll provide a feedback to see whether the groundwater quality management plans are actually effective or not. So that's kind of in a nutshell why we're asking the coalitions to develop these groundwater quality assessment reports. And we're going to Central Coast, or are we going to go? Okay.
So when we put this together, it was all put together for the regional boards and the state board, but right now we'll go to the second PowerPoint.
I have a
Okay.
question.
Yeah.
On the arrows, the chart with all the arrows,
Should go back.
the assessment reports. So I understand that this is all new, it's under development, but what would you expect to see in terms of change through time? You're saying that a high vulnerability area could become,
Yeah, and that
no
may
longer
take
a high vulnerability area. What's your sense of how long?
That will really depend, but we're probably talking years and maybe decades, depending on which area you're looking at. Now, part of the way our orders are structured is that we're expecting growers to comply with receiving water limitations, which basically say they can't cause or contribute to an exceedance of objectives or a trend of degradation that might impact beneficial uses. So as soon as they're implementing those practices that seem like they're protective of water quality, they're meeting those receiving water limitations. Now, it may take years or decades before you actually see the response in the aquifer from those changes in practices at the land surface. But the obligation to the grower will be on a shorter time scale.
Well, my observation here is that the vulnerability definition, going back to my previous question, seems to not only describe the physical properties of the system and nearness to shallow groundwater and that sort of thing, but also the actual water quality, that an area with higher contaminant levels is more vulnerable by your definition.
Well, and as you as you hear from our coalitions, you'll see that they've used quite a bit of information to try to put together and evaluate vulnerability. So you can certainly use water quality information, and as John mentioned, that may not be complete in certain areas. Especially we're in a lot of rural areas, we don't necessarily have data for all of those areas. So we're relying on other sources of information, such as things like depth to groundwater, soil type, that sort of thing. And you'll hear from them as they discuss it. And also what the typical farming practices and farming situation is. All of that will help inform what the vulnerability designation should be.
And I know you're managing expectations as far as outcome, but aren't there examples where management practices have resulted in improvements on timescales shorter than years and decades?
Oh, in terms of with groundwater quality improvement, I'll let Clay speak to that. He's the assistant executive officer out of the Fresno office and our lead on the groundwater quality aspects of our program.
Thank you.
I mean, certainly, it really depends upon the hydrogeologic conditions, upon that time frame that you'll see changes. You could be in an extremely vulnerable area where you have very sandy soils, that very shallow groundwater. You don't have much of a vadose zone, so you don't have much of that accumulated mass that's got to get transported through. And we would expect that in shallow groundwater, we can see improvements in fairly short time periods. And we actually have in our dairy program, in some of those areas, seen rapid improvements. Within a year, we see changes in water quality. In areas where groundwater is deeper, and let's say you've got a 100-foot vadose zone, you've got a long history of this activity, you may have a significant mass of those constituents tied up in the vadose zone, and you basically have to go through the process to flush those out. In those instances, it may take decades for that flushing to occur, and therefore those changes in water quality, you're not going to see for a substantial amount of time. And that's a little bit of the complexity that we've had to deal with, because we need to work to understand which management practices are protective under different conditions, get those appropriate management practices implemented so that over the long term we can be assured that we should see improvements, and then do monitoring to confirm that those improvements are done in accordance with what we see. And if something's different than what our models basically tell us, then implement appropriate practices as we move forward. So it can occur quickly in certain conditions, but in other conditions it's going to take a very long time.
So now to the coalitions.
So next up will be our representative from the California Rice Commission, Tim Johnson, to make a presentation. And following Tim will be Perry Clausen with the East San Joaquin Valley Coalition.
Madam Chair, members of the board, Tim Johnson, President of the California Rice Commission. We also are the coalition for the rice farmers in the Sacramento Valley. You'll be pleased to know that I am actually not the one giving the bulk of this presentation. We have our technical experts here, Summer Bundy with CH2M Hill. We also have had this project significantly contributed to by Dr. John Dickey, who's with Planterra as an agronomist. We're here today largely because we're concerned about the groundwater mapping undertaken by the State Board, not in the quality of the work, but we believe that the mapping provided under the Groundwater Assessment Report is more robust, will lead to less confusion, and also not add to additional work that the coalitions may have to do as the mapping provided by your staff. We believe that the mapping provided by the WDR in the Central Valley WDR is more than sufficient. We'll walk through that and really make our case. We're going to talk to you about our process. It was over 2 years and $250,000 in the process of developing. So give me that. Here I'll just briefly talk about California rice and water quality. We have, as an industry, been managing water quality actively since the early 1980s. Our first programs began with Central Valley Board, and previous to that, Department of Pesticide Regulation on surface water. This is just a graphic that shows the time and the energy that our industry and regulatory agencies spent developing first a comprehensive understanding of surface water quality, working with regulatory agencies as well as the University of California for the purposes of understanding rice's impact on surface water. 2009, we picked up all of the surface water programs under the first program that impacted us, called the Rice Pesticide Program. I'm not getting it to advance. There it is. There we go. Okay, next slide. What we did is we applied then the learning from the surface water program, where we took over 10 years of monitoring data, a rigorous assessment of our pesticides, how they're used, and their water quality data, and then put that into an annual program on surface water for our irrigated lands program. We took that exact same approach then as we advanced into the WDR, groundwater portion of our industry. The surface water program started with the rice pesticide program, advanced into the irrigated lands program, and groundwater starts with this groundwater assessment report, as Joe had mentioned. And our objective is really to summarize the existing data specific to rice. One of the earlier discussions was there was an assumption in one of these maps that overlying activities in the surface would presume that there would be impact, and we'll show, I think, very convincingly in the case of rice that is not the case. Our objective has really been to provide a scientific basis for a rice-specific WDR through a conceptual model that Summer Bundy will walk through.
So the purpose of our groundwater quality assessment report, I think Joe covered in some detail, is to develop a technical analysis to support a long-term program of monitoring and implementation. And we approached this by evaluating different types of environmental data. We had field research performed by the UC Cooperative Extension, historic groundwater quality data, and we pulled that together to evaluate rice-specific vulnerability. Rice lands are located within the Sacramento Valley. There's about 500,000 acres. This map shows the NRCS soil drainage classifications throughout the Sac Valley. The green shows more poorly drained soils, such as clay soils, with the red tending toward the sandier spectrum, and in the middle you have loamier soils. The crosshatched area is the rice lands, and as you can see, the majority of rice is sited on low permeability, poorly drained soils, primarily clays. Within rice lands, we have generally high groundwater quality. Rice is grown in contiguous blocks, so a well located in the vicinity of rice lands is typically representative of rice farming activities. And rice farming has been farmed relatively consistently since the early 80s, so the management practices with respect to pesticides and nutrient and other applied materials have been relatively consistent throughout the different farming operations. Rice is very sensitive to over-fertilization. Unlike many crops, if you over-fertilize, you decrease yield. And so the UC has put a great deal of effort into developing nutrient management tools to help rice farmers target their nutrient application practices. And nitrogen is applied primarily as ammonia fertilizer. This slide, on the left-hand side, you see those state board vulnerability areas, the hydrologic vulnerability areas that Dory talked about, along with the DPR groundwater protection areas. So the pink is the state board areas. Within the Sac Valley, you can see that they're primarily along the rivers where there's coarser grained alluvial sediments. And the DPR areas, those are based on DPR's modeling of subsurface conditions relative to pesticide risks. When we intersect those areas in the GIS tool with the 500,000 acres of rice, you get the areas in the pink. That's about 50,000 acres, representing 10% of rice. Again, primarily along the rivers and the bypasses, and then some concentrated over in the Yuba County, North and South Yuba subbasins of the DWR groundwater basins. We developed a conceptual model to help define how the applied materials interact with the subsurface environment. We looked at above ground operations, so how fertilizers and irrigation practices are managed. We looked at the root zone and how nitrate is transformed within that root zone, and then groundwater quality data to understand how those conditions contribute to groundwater quality impacts. We have a really good understanding of how rice is farmed. We have a calendar that is pretty consistent from year to year depending on when the bypasses get drained, but we have a good understanding of when fertilizers and other materials are applied to rice, and that really informs the development of our conceptual model. So this picture depicts how potential contaminants move throughout a groundwater system. There's pathways and transformations are shown in red, and sources and sinks are shown in blue. And from a rice-specific perspective, we see a clay layer that confines that shallow zone. And the flooded irrigation practices in rice farming contribute to a saturated root zone. And that saturated root zone has geochemical properties that limit the movement of nitrate into the groundwater system.
Yeah, with this conceptual model, the arrow sizes don't necessarily represent the flux, right?
Correct.
Because I would think with that perched water, you'd have a bigger arrow if you were representing flux going toward the stream than to the groundwater beneath.
Correct, and the idea was to make this generalized for a variety of contaminants that we were, potential contaminants that we were evaluating, conceptual being the key. So now we'll get into some of the environmental data that we reviewed. The Rice Commission was really forward-thinking in recognizing that nitrate groundwater review was going to be on the table moving into the future. And so they worked with the UC Cooperative Extension, and the Cooperative Extension worked with rice growers to implement a shallow root zone study evaluating nitrate flux within and below the root zone. So there's, I think, 8 sampling sites that were identified representing a range of different soil conditions, so the lower permeability clays as well as more coarsely drained soils. And the graph shows what the results were between 5 and 6 feet below the root zone, below the ground surface. The MCL for nitrate is N is 10 micrograms per liter, milligrams per liter, and the results shown over there show less than 1 milligram per liter in that area below the root zone. So that would be sort of the source that would be available to impact groundwater. So a relatively weak source of nitrate below the root zone. We also evaluated groundwater quality data, since it's a groundwater program. There's a lot of data out there. There's the Gamma GeoTracker data. There's other data sets that lie with USGS and DWR. What we sought to do was identify a suite of data that would help us provide a clear analysis. We looked for data sets that were close to rice farms, represented a range of constituents since this was for the whole groundwater quality assessment, not just nitrate. We wanted wells that represented a range of depth conditions, so shallow, medium, and deep groundwater conditions, and we were leaned toward data sets that were documented and peer-reviewed. And once we had those, we compared those results to the various drinking water triggers that are established within statute. So this map shows that range of evaluated well networks. There's 3 data sets that are included. My favorite data set on the planet is the USGS rice wells. These were wells drilled by USGS specifically for the purpose of assessing the impact of rice farming on shallow groundwater quality. They're 30 to 50 feet deep. They're well documented and published. An additional data set is the USGS domestic wells, and these are domestic wells used by rural residential citizens located primarily on the eastern side of the Sac Valley, not as close to rice as some of the other data sets, but they do provide information on background conditions within the region. And then the USGS Gamma wells, this was work funded by the State Water Resources Control Board for the monitoring of deeper municipal wells. And as you can see, there's pretty good coverage throughout the Sac Valley and throughout the rice farming areas. The results for nitrate in groundwater quality within the Sacramento Valley show relatively high water quality that meets water quality objectives. Within the USGS rice wells, there was no well that exceeded the 10 milligram per liter MCL. Within the shallow domestic wells, there were 2 wells. You can see them over there in red on the map, but they're located up gradient of rice wells and do not appear to be impacted by rice farming. And then 2 of the deep wells, one over there in Yolo County, well outside of the rice farming areas, and then one up north of the North Yuba area, up gradient of the rice wells. So our work evaluated multiple lines of evidence. We looked at crops and soil information. We looked at how nitrogen is applied to rice, and we looked at water quality data. And based on our analysis, we were able to conclude that rice poses a low risk to groundwater quality and have evidence of that low risk. And that analysis forms the basis of a trend monitoring program that's sufficient for the low risk condition and also appropriate to that condition. And that concludes my approach, or my analysis.
Just make some concluding comments. We have a strong belief that this is the most comprehensive assessment of groundwater quality under rice today, and certainly will be moving forward. We also believe that this map provided in our groundwater assessment report fully meets the needs of this board as it moves forward. Throughout this process and others that the board are considering, I would just like to make an added comment that outreach to coalitions, to other water users as this board considers this decision and others, really allow expertise. We are also very highly vested with interest in these issues. We're going to allow this board to make better decisions and really avoid conflicts, you know, as this board looks to manage water quality and water supply in the future. Thank you very much. Be happy to answer any of your questions. Actually, I'm going to make just one more comment. That the designation by this board in its maps of areas that are vulnerable or of concern have direct regulatory impact, in this case on rice. We've shown, I think, very convincingly, even to the Regional Water Board staff, that rice does not constitute significant concern and no areas that are vulnerable. We have a trend monitoring program then is reflective of that. State board maps come out and confuse that issue, only generate more work on our behalf or potentially additional monitoring requirements because of the inconsistency of the in-depth work that we had done and perhaps the less time for the state board to develop its maps. And that's really the crux of our concern is this work's comprehensive. It's taken significant amounts of time and we've got a lot vested in this. And that any map that the state puts forward, we think, for the Central Valley really ought to include these groundwater assessment maps generated by the coalition groups. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is the 3rd time I've seen this presentation, and it gets better every time. Question for regional board staff. Have you reviewed the report and do you concur with the report's findings and recommendations?
Yeah, so we have reviewed the report, and actually, one of the things we appreciated was that the rice industry was very proactive. So they developed the groundwater quality assessment report before their order hasn't actually been adopted. Our board's going to consider that at the end of this month. And in many ways, that probably made it more painful, but also it was helpful because since we didn't have the requirements in place, we had a lot of back and forth on what that should look like. However, I think where it was really helpful is now as we're moving forward in the order, we don't have that additional report they have to prepare, and we've been able to incorporate a trend monitoring network already rather than having that sort of as a deliverable. So certainly as staff, we felt that what they did met the requirements that we anticipate our board would have adopted. It's consistent with the other orders that our board has adopted. And I think one of the things that we appreciate is there is a lot that's unique about rice from a number of perspectives, and Summer went over those. But having that USGS study was really beneficial, and I think lent heavily to the weight of evidence, suggesting and demonstrating that rice really doesn't pose a high risk with respect to nitrates in groundwater.
A follow-up question to John, both Johns. I had requested that this presentation be made to us, I think a month or so ago, because I was very interested in the study and very interested in the findings and the maps that were generated. And at that time, I had asked staff to think about how we, in developing our own map, could consider and incorporate some of this information. And are you able at this time to share some of your thoughts and ideas on how we might do that?
Well, I think that from my point of view, they really have two distinct areas two different purposes that we could use the maps for. And so though we started out with the idea that we're going to use these maps primarily for increased regulatory scrutiny. And
when I'm sorry, when you say these maps, you are talking about?
The maps that we proposed under the report to the legislature. But looking at the information that's being developed by the coalitions and in conjunction with the Region 5, they are very focused on their on the use of these for regulatory approaches. They're going to have more detailed information about that. They have more interaction about that than we would ever have. And so it seems to me that that makes sense for the coalitions in the local areas to be focused on working together to determine the areas of where more detailed regulatory work needs to be done. And so I think that part of the equation, given on what we've been seeing and talking to the regions about, makes sense to be developed on the local level with the local folks. The other side of that, though, is that the other part of this concern is how do we tell people that they might be in an area where there's concerns for nitrate in their drinking water? It's not the same as the areas that are you would use for regulatory, increased regulatory scrutiny. They may overlap in some areas, but they're not necessarily the same. And so at least from my point of view, it seems to be that we need two different sets of maps to be looking at that. One that is developed primarily on a statewide basis to provide folks that have a potential. It doesn't mean that we know, because if we knew, we'd tell them right now, that their well has nitrates. And another is for the regional boards to working with their permittees to look at areas where they have where they might need higher scrutiny.
I don't know how you will do that without confusing people, because you're confusing me.
Okay.
Two sets of maps, one at the state level, one at the local level. the state maps, we've said in the report and in the report to the legislature that the state maps will be used for additional regulatory focus.
Well, I agree with you on that, but what we've learned as putting this work group together is that that's probably more appropriate at a local level than at a statewide level. And so
we're going to say that the state board produced maps will not be used for regulatory purposes?
Well, that's my suggestion, given that what we've heard from the folks is that they have a better and more detailed understanding of the regulatory implications than we would.
But if the state maps show areas where there are potential for nitrates concerns, but we say, oh, well, don't worry about it, it's the regional maps that would actually focus on where the regulatory activities are, and if they don't match up, I'm
Well,
still
I think
confused.
Okay, well, I don't know how to explain it differently to you, so this is why this has been such a difficult problem for our staff, is that when you look at the different purposes, you get different areas, you get different maps. You're not going to have the same map for looking at areas where you have concern about the drinking water as you will as a map that is concerned about what the regulatory approach is. And that's been the problem of trying to combine those two concepts together in one map. It doesn't work. And so my suggestion, it may not be the best suggestion, was that we think about a two-pronged approach, but maybe that's not the best.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll stop where I'm behind and still confused.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Member Dodig for asking those questions. And what I'm going to attempt to do is just get a better understanding about overlays of the various maps. Because I can't quite tell, do you have, could you go to the slide that shows sort of your outcome on, okay. So this would be an area that you would focus on, but even within this map, it's showing that, maybe you could, if you could just describe it,
So from a
on the
regulatory
trouble spots.
From a regulatory perspective, the rice lands would be designated as low vulnerability, and the wells that are identified as red would fall outside of rice lands, and therefore rice would not be subjected to requirements within those areas. Those 4 wells shown there are being impacted by some practice other than rice. So from a regulatory perspective, all of this rice land would be designated as low vulnerability.
Okay, so low vulnerability according to,
The Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program and its definition of vulnerability and the associated additional requirements. For high vulnerability areas, farmers have more stringent reporting requirements and there's more stringent monitoring requirements.
okay, but low vulnerability using the tool that Region 5 just walked us through? Okay, so the information is consistent with that with respect to characterization of vulnerability.
Correct. So the Rice Commission went through this exercise and looked at all rice land, so all 500,000 plus acres, and bringing together all of that information, the water quality data, the conceptual model, understanding of rice farming practices. The conclusion with respect to nitrates and other potential constituents is that rice would be considered, those rice lands would be considered a low vulnerability area, meaning that there aren't the exceedances of objectives attributable to rice, and there does not appear to be any threat in terms of degradation that could lead to an impact to beneficial uses associated with rice. Now that, you know, just to be clear, that doesn't mean we don't keep monitoring or looking,
Right.
and that they don't have to do any reporting. It's just a lower or reduced level. And one quick point I wanted to make, I don't know if this will add to your confusion or maybe help clarify, but this is, I think, a good map to point out the issue that I think John was raising, is this map is for the Irrigated Lands Program. So it's how we're regulating irrigated lands. So we didn't go to the Rice Commission, we're not going to go to the other coalitions and say, well, provide us with a map that shows us everything about groundwater within your watershed, we're going to ask that it be focused on the irrigated lands or the rice lands. So when they're pointing out there are some of these wells that are upgradient of rice, that's not their problem to deal with. And in the context of the irrigated lands program, it's not our problem to deal with from a regulatory perspective. Now, that's not to say that those people who are drinking from those wells should be told, or in that area should be told, hey, there might be a problem here. It just may not be associated with rice.
So what I'm wondering, if this map accurately describes rice lands, does your map include some other characterization, as you say, areas that are outside rice lands that may also have nitrate problems? And if so, is there a way to describe that on a map and then just fold that into what we're looking at the state level?
Well, so the maps that will be developed through our irrigated lands regulatory program will just be particular to that program. There's not a Central Valley Regional Board effort to do a similar kind of assessment broadly for the whole region. We're certainly covering a lot of ground, by even, focusing on irrigated lands. We're covering over 7 million acres within our region. So we will have these maps that will be particular to the irrigated lands areas within our region, which will identify high and low vulnerability areas. And certainly in some cases, there will be some sort of non-irrigated land that are included in those maps. And once you get to Perry and see Perry Clausen and see what the Eastside Coalition has done, you'll see what that looks like when there are problems. Okay, so this was a good example of, when you go through this analysis and it doesn't look like there's any vulnerability associated with irrigated cropland. And then Perry will walk you through when there's a pretty significant portion of their area where there's high vulnerability. But okay.
Well, so Tim, I guess you have something to say, but I would ask you to respond to this as well. This looks pretty refined compared to what we would have. Do you have any suggestions for how this could be incorporated into our map or overlaid, and then somehow also providing information to address the concern that, from a public policy perspective, of people needing to be put on notice about vulnerabilities that may be, unrelated to rice production?
Sure.
How do we get that information out?
And let me sort of answer. First, I just want to point out, because it builds to your ultimate point, these are rice lands in the Sacramento Valley. These are specific to the production of our crop. Now, the Sacramento Valley Water Quality Coalition is not here today, but also uses CH2M Hills, going through the same process. Its groundwater assessment report. If you were to overlay their map and our map, you're going to have a very comprehensive view, really from foothill to foothill. So even though here it may seem like, I don't really know what's out there, most of us who've been in the Sacramento Valley know that's all agriculture, right? Maybe some municipal sources as well. I think we could sit down with your staff and come up with a recommendation on how we might be able to incorporate this. I think the challenge that we've had, which really gets to my concluding comment, is we have not had that ability to have that dialogue with your staff. And really, the maps have been developed without input from the coalitions, other than the one briefing that we had with your staff. Certainly no significant, I would just say no discussion with the Department of Food and Agriculture. So if this board believes that your MOU has somehow generated a process with the coalition groups at the Department of Food and Ag, that's also not occurred. So that issue of engaging stakeholders who have a significant vested interest, I think, is important to this process and others, that you're considering that have equal or more profound impact. I think the information that we have, we could with regard to specifically notifying people could easily be pulled out from data and information and provided. And I would certainly be open to that, and I would assume the other coalitions would as well. From a RICE perspective, we would just want to make sure that the most detailed, best available information is what is provided as this board takes its action. Clearly, the groundwater assessment reports provided by our coalition and others are going to be far more robust, far more detailed, and provide the public with far greater information, right, than maps with large colored areas may create concern. And I'll just be blunt. The concern that I have is not only the public concern of I'm next to a rice field and I'm in a blue area, and is that the rice field that's creating my problem? We think the answer is no. But similar to that is regulatory agencies moving forward. That disconnect between a color on a map that the state board said is highly vulnerable for nitrate, that's inconsistent with a detailed groundwater assessment report, is only going to create confusion and jeopardy for the regulated community who's already answered that question. And well, as these groundwater assessment reports get completed within the next 12 months for the